It's not a secret to anyone that in my opinion the 60s are the best decade in the history of music. From the British invasion to the reinvention of jazz to the colorful, psychedelic explosion of the late 60s, it's more than clear to me that the 60s were a before and after for music. But another reason why I love this era of music so much comes in the form of an album, released in December of 1965 by the greatest band of all time. The band's name is The Beatles and the album's called Rubber Soul. Explaining why I like Rubber Soul so much is really complicated, especially because unlike other albums by the Beatles where you have that massive hit, that song that everyone loves, for example, While My Guitar Gently Weeps in the White Album, A Day in the Life in Sgt. Pepper's, Something in Abbey Road, you don't really have that in Rubber Soul. I know a lot of you probably want to kill me for saying that, but bear with me for a moment. I think we can all agree that the most popular song in this album, In My Life, doesn't even come close to the level of popularity a song like Let It Be from the Let It Be album has. But I personally believe that this album is the most important piece of music the band ever released, and it's also one of the best. I mean, you do have an incredible level of quality throughout the entire track list of this album, to the point where this was considered an early version of a concept album, not really because of the narrative or even the instrumentation, but the uniform excellence, in the words of Brian Wilson, the album enjoyed. Given the fact that the Beatles also released albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's, really important for the pop music scene and the psychedelic music scene, how can I say that this is the most important piece of music? Well, in my opinion, this album is the genesis of the experimental side of the Beatles. This was the first time we saw the Beatles trying something no one else had tried before. Of course, the Beatles were already considered groundbreaking prior to this album, I know that. I mean, the British invasion came as a result of the Beatles coming to the US and performing in the Ed Sullivan Show. Plus that, melodic energy they added to rock and roll music was also very groundbreaking at the time, but that doesn't even come close to all the different experimentation, not only in the music but also in the recording studio, they implemented in Rubber Soul. And I think the best way to analyze the genius of Rubber Soul is not looking at the whole album, but looking at the contributions by every single one of the band members individually. I know that's a weird approach. The Beatles are a band, and at this point they were collaborating a lot and they were working together to write the songs, but I think this is also the point where George, John, and Paul started to write their own stuff and go their own way and kind of separate themselves from each other when it comes to their creative approach to songwriting. And I think the best way to analyze that creative divorce that was happening inside of the group and that resulted in some of the greatest releases of all time is by taking a look at their contributions individually and seeing how they affected them as artists.
Oh, not really, we're just having a good laugh and everyone seemed to enjoy it. So we had a good time, what's the point in being serious all the time?
Now, I did say that John, Paul, and George were the ones who changed the most during the recording sessions of this album, but I want to start with Ringo here because, in my opinion, he's quite underrated when it comes to his contributions for this album. This was the point where I started to understand what people meant when they said that Ringo was a total genius when it comes to drumming, Now, it's really hard to explain why Ringo's contributions were so important for this album and why they make him such a genius, because a lot of times percussion is quite plain, there's nothing too special about it, and most of the times when it comes to production they kind of fall to the back of the mix. But you have to understand that before this album the Beatles were a rock and roll band. There's only a few songs that were a little slower, maybe a songs that were a little faster, but for the most part it was a rock and roll band. And percussion for rock and roll groups, most rock and roll songs, it doesn't really matter if it's an original tune, you most likely have a blueprint of what type of percussion the song needs in some songs from the past, either because they have a similar melody or because they have a similar chord progression or maybe because they have a similar tempo. You don't really need to dig that deep to find the right drumming for the track because there's multiple rock and roll songs that probably sound really similar. That's not the case with Rubber Soul at all. Rubber Soul was groundbreaking from the instrumentation to the songwriting to the production, and that made Ringo's job as the drummer a lot more complicated because you basically have to create a style of percussion for this new sound the band is bringing to you, and of course albums like Highway 61 Revisited, Bringing It All Back Home, The Byrds, for example, with Mr. Tambourine Man, had already introduced a certain style that Ringo might have copied or taken inspiration from, but the style of folk rock music that the Beatles introduced in Rubber Soul had a lot of psychedelia infused in it, had a lot of jazz, a lot of pop music, and a lot of rock, heavier versions of rock infused in it too. do. So it wasn't as simple as just copy this guy or do what that guy did. You have to come up with new ways to adorn the track and, keep the rhythm with your percussion. And Ringo doesn't get nearly enough credit for doing that because he did an amazing job. Look at songs like Drive My Car. Look at songs like What Goes On, for example, his own track. Look at songs like I'm Looking Through You. All of these different minimalist styles of percussion that he used throughout the whole album were incredible and fit perfectly with the sound the band had developed up to that point. And that's not the only thing that Ringo developed in this album. You also have his signature, incredibly influential, fill in the blanks style of drumming that you can see at its full potential in songs like Something and While My Guitar Gently Weeps. When the instrumentation goes a little too quiet, Ringo jumps in with a few drum kicks that makes the listener feel like something's happening, even though it's supposed to be a slow moment in the track. It's amazing. It makes the song sound more fulfilled and accomplished, and one of the first times we saw him doing that was in the song In My Life in this album. So the next time you're listening to this album, don't overlook the drumming, don't overlook Ringo's contributions because they're super important and they're one of his greatest achievements. So yeah.
No, I'm not. No. Well, John's written a book, so he must be more intelligent than me. You've got to be intelligent to write books.
Now it's time to talk about Paul, and I have to say that he confuses the hell out of me in this album. I love every single one of his songs here. You Won't See Me, Drive My Car, Michelle, incredible music, but I don't really have a lot to say. This style of songwriting that he's showcasing here, he already showcased in albums like Help and even Beatles for Sale in songs like What You're Doing and I'll Follow the Sun. In Help, it was Yesterday, and I've Just Seen a Face, which you can actually find in the US version of the record. His songwriting is on point, his performances are on point, but there's not really a lot of growth. I think that the real growth came in the Help album, and then after that in Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's. I don't really think that McCartney had like a massive shift in terms of what he wanted from music in 1965. Maybe it's because, by this point, he was the only Beatle member that hadn't taken LSD, and I know this is a really controversial topic because a lot of people seem to believe that drugs have nothing to do with music. I don't really agree, and even the people that wrote the songs don't even agree, but it's undeniable that taking LSD was a huge reason why George and John had such a massive change in their sound in this album and Paul McCartney didn't. So that's the only reason I can possibly find, but for the most part, Paul McCartney has some of his most elegant and sophisticated songwriting in this album. The backing vocals, he was the star of the backing vocals and the harmonies of this album. You can find him in every single one of the songs, providing the higher tunes and sometimes even the lowest ones, which are usually performed by Lennon. I mean, he was definitely really invested in the recording of this album, and that's kind of like the only positive thing I can say about his development as a musician in this album. But for the most part, the Paul McCartney we saw in Rubber Soul is the same one we saw in Beatles for Sale and in Help. I know a lot of people want to talk about his bass lines in this album, and they are pretty good. His job as the bassist of the group was definitely on point as well, but I don't see them as being too different from the ones in Help and even in albums like A Hard Day's Night, which was released almost 2 years prior to the recording of Rubber Soul, So I just don't really see a lot of growth, and I don't really want to waste too much of your time telling you things that Paul was already doing years in the past when I'm talking about, Rubber Soul. Well, maybe there's one more thing I can say. The song Michelle is the first time that Paul McCartney showcased such an elegant and sophisticated style of songwriting, and that evolved into songs like For No One, She's Leaving Home, and Honey Pie in albums like the White Album, Sgt. Pepper's, and Revolver. So yeah, maybe that's some sort of growth as well. Let's move on.
We play marbles. Or marples.
Now let's go with who probably was my favorite Beatle in this album, and that is George Harrison. The level of growth this man enjoyed in the recording sessions of this album was massive. We already saw his potential as a songwriter in the track I Need You in the album Help. Prior to that, he had written some songs already, but not really up to par with that of the Lennon and McCartney compositions, obviously. I Need You was the first time where he seemed to be the protagonist of his own song. It wasn't wasn't only a song that was supposed to be there just because we need a George song, just like we have a Ringo song. No, the song was picked for its undeniable quality. Something similar happens in Rubber Soul with the songs If I Needed Someone and Think for Yourself. These two are among the most incredible songs that George Harrison ever wrote, even if you want to add his solo discography on top of it, okay? We're talking about shiny guitars, beautiful and cute melodies, and incredible vocal harmonies in the song If I Needed Someone, and then you have the heavy fuzz bass and introspective lyrics in Think for Yourself. But the greatness of those two tracks are only the beginning of George Harrison's contributions to this album. I mean, the guitar playing in this record is magnificent, wonderful, stellar. The album would not be the same without the cold, calculated, and sharp guitar playing that George Harrison offers throughout the entire track list. And that's only when the track needs it, because when the track needed a shiny guitar riff that flows throughout the whole thing, that's exactly what Harrison delivered. And that's the reason why, in my opinion, his best guitar work is found in this album. Okay, so we have incredible songwriting and incredible guitar playing. Is that the only thing? Nope, there's one more thing that Harrison contributed to one of the songs in this album that made the song a pioneering force in the psychedelic music genre, and that was his sitar playing in the song Norwegian Wood. Now, mind you, the song was written by John Lennon, and we will talk about that song in a minute, but it's undeniable that the reason why the song was so important for the band's sound was because of George Harrison's sitar. I mean, it added a layer of complexity to the sound of the band, and that resulted in albums like Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's, and all those things together, the guitar playing, the songwriting, and the experimentation make George Harrison one of the MVPs of the album. And this was the point where people started to realize that George Harrison wasn't only a great songwriter, but also a creative powerhouse that had the potential to become one of the greatest songwriters of all time.
Same reason anybody gets married. Don't want to be slushy like, but you do, don't you? When you want to get married, when you got to go, you got to go. I always say.
If you know anything about the story of the Beatles or about the story of John Lennon, you probably know that he was a totally different person after 1965, and the genesis of that change is found in Rubber Soul. By the time they were recording Rubber Soul, John Lennon was no stranger to dealing with personal themes in his music. We saw that in Beatles for Sale, in tracks like I'm a Loser. We saw that in You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, and the title track from the album Help. We were also seeing Bob Dylan's clear influence in John Lennon's music, making it sound more confrontational and precise. There was a lot of change happening inside of John Lennon, and all of that change exploded into Rubber Soul, making his growth as a songwriter be far, far greater than that of any of the other Beatles. From the first John Lennon song in this album, Norwegian Wood, you can see the massive change in both sound and lyrics. I mean, this is a song about him cheating on his wife, which was very different from anything else that John Lennon had written at the time, and the melody that he uses was never before seen not only in John Lennon's own catalog, but in the history of rock and roll bands up until 1965. I mean, it was not normal that a rock and roll band that was supposed to be lively and energetic and sometimes romantic was writing this type of melody that felt very, mystical and poetic. And that's what a lot of people don't really understand. I mean, up until this point, the Beatles were a pop rock band. I know that a lot of you don't like to hear that, but that's what they were. They were groundbreaking. Their sound was more melodic than usual. They did a lot of unique things, but they were still a pop rock band. And I feel like the first time that people started to notice that the Beatles were evolving into something completely different, into one of the greatest bands of all time, was with the song Norwegian Wood, because of the sitar, because of the melody, because of the way that McCartney jumps into the into the middle eight, without necessarily harmonizing with John, but basically adding power, accentuating the melody instead of just joining it. This is the beginning of John Lennon as an incredible storyteller, and this song is special for a lot of unique reasons, but once again, this is only the beginning of his contributions to this album, because right after this you have Nowhere Man, not only an incredibly philosophical song in terms of lyrics for a rock and roll band, but also more than enough evidence that only the Beach Boys were able to fuck with the Beatles in terms of harmonies, because the harmonies in this song are incredible. But that's enough about songwriting and harmonies and lyrics for the moment. Let's talk about performance, because this album features one of John Lennon's best performances, and kind of like the prelude to how influential he was going to be in the future with albums like Plastic Ono Band and the White Album and even Imagine in terms of performance. There's very few performances in 1965 from the rock and roll and even folk rock genre that are as passionate as John Lennon's Girl. The storytelling in this song is fantastic. There's this air of desire spread throughout the lyrics in this track, but I think no one can argue with me when I say that the main catch of the song is John Lennon's ultra passionate performance. His level of commitment to the performance is so incredibly large that he actually sounds like he's desperate. Like Like, I really do feel desperation coming from his voice, filtering through the melody, you know, and that's the reason why, even if you don't relate, even if you're female and you've never been in love with a woman, you know what he's talking about. You can feel related to it just because of his performance, you know. And if you're a man, I'm pretty sure you can relate even more, because we've all had that lady in our lives that we seem to desire with all of our being, even though she constantly humiliates us and makes us feel like trash. There's a couple other songs I could talk about, like Run For Your Life or Wait, but I want to close this video by talking about what, in my opinion, is one of John Lennon's best songs, and one of the best songs from the 60s in my life. The level of emotion he portrays in this song, the backing vocals, the instrumentation, the incredibly precise guitar playing, the drumming, everything comes together to create one of the best Beatles songs ever. And I feel like the reason why this song is so special to me is because it represents the first time that John Lennon became entangled with the idea of writing music that was meaningful for him, not really meaningful for the music industry or for the fans or whomever else, you know, that might be interested in his craft. It seems to me like in 1966 and 1967, John Lennon was trying to entertain himself with his music. He wasn't really trying to prove anything to anyone. While in the past, even when he was trying to write songs about something that concerned him or something that he wanted to celebrate, for example, the song You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, Help and I'm a Loser, who I've quoted before, he seemed to do it in a way while even if people didn't pay attention to what he was saying, people could still enjoy the track. You know, it was melodic, energetic, it was fun. Instead, In My Life seems to be the first time that John Lennon said, you know, I don't care about anything else. I don't care about the melody. I don't care about the instrumentation. I want every other element of the track that has nothing to do with me to match the energy of my performance and my lyrics and my song. And that's exactly what In My Life is. It's a weird song, you know, it sounds like it's not supposed to be in Rubber Soul, and it kind of disrupts the pace of the album a little bit, because, you know, up until this point, every single song in here has been, you know, quite energetic, keeping a certain pace, even in songs like Michelle that even though that song is a little slower and definitely feels a little bit more simple in terms of instrumentation from the rest of the album, I feel like it fits the track list way more than In My Life. But In My Life is such an important moment in the whole album because of what it represents, that I feel like even though it doesn't really match in terms of the instrumentation, we accept it for what it is. You know, we accept it as a transitional moment in John Lennon's songwriting, because we've seen preludes of it in Norwegian Wood, in The Word, and Nowhere Man, but In My Life capitalizes on that change and tells people, especially if you've heard the rest of the band's discography already, this is the moment where John Lennon changed. This is the moment where the rock and roll John Lennon became the creative powerhouse that we saw in the second half of the 60s. And for that reason, this remains as one of the most important compositions by the band, and one of the main reasons why Rubber Soul, in my opinion, is the most important release by the Beatles.
Tell me, how did you find America?
Turn left to Greenland.
Has success changed your life?
Yes.
Do you often see your father? No, actually, we're just good friends.
And that is going to be it for today's video. I really hope that you guys enjoyed watching as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. Please do remember that this whole video is only my personal opinion, the way I see Rubber Soul and the reasons why I believe it's the most important release by the band. There's a lot of things I didn't say about the album, you know, how much it sold, how influential it was for a lot of different genres, but I wanted to focus on how much the band grew while making this album, because I believe that, you know, even though albums like Sgt. Pepper's and Revolver were more influential overall, we wouldn't have those albums if not for Rubber Soul, and I think I explained the reasons why in this video, which is exactly what I wanted this video to be, an explanation of why, in my opinion, this album was the genesis of the creative explosion the Beatles enjoyed in the second half of the 60s. So yeah, once again, I hope that you enjoyed, and I hope that I can see you soon with a new video. But until then, bye.